Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo, starting with Part 2, Book the 8th, Chapter 2. But first, reading wise, I am reading Womb City still. I Mm, might finish it next week. I don't know. I don't know why I ever say when I'm gonna finish something because it never works out that way. But it is a futuristic sci-fi story about this person named Nayla who has body hopped into a body that has committed a crime before. So that means that this body is microchipped and she is analyzed all the time to see her potential for crime again. And it's intense. It's very weird as well. I'm not super sure if I am going to like it at the end. It's gonna, I think, really depend on how the story wraps up. I think that something structurally that I would have liked is if there were different parts, like a part one, a part two, a part three, because it seems like there's very distinct parts in the story. And I think that would have been better instead of just changing so drastically the projection of the story without having those divisions. I think that's what I would have liked better, but it's fine. We'll see how it goes. It is an advanced copy. It does not get published until January, so I will be writing a more in-depth review. If you're on Patreon, you will get that review. Um, and then I'm reading The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I'm reading it because it won for memoir of best memoir in 2023. So I'm going through all of the best ofs as according to different readers on Goodreads, and this one won for memoir, and I've only had like two sittings with it, and I'm pretty far in. I'm on page 185 out of 277. So it's a very quick read. It's very fast. It's just um pretty surface level, and I think that's why it's so easy to read and so quick to read is just because like I don't have to really think at all or like do any sort of analysis or any sort of like deciphering of or even like soaking in beautiful language or anything like that. It's pretty much like any or at least a lot of celebrity memoirs in that it's like this is what happened and then this happened and then this is what it was like when I was a child, like that sort of thing. Um yeah. Yeah. And I think that's all I'm reading. All I'm reading and all I'm watching. Yeah. And I'm playing Spider-Man too. I am not very far into it though. I say that every time, and I think I say that because I don't want like everybody to get excited and then just start saying things, and I'm not going to be where I am. Okay, so today we're going to be reading The Man Who Laughs, but what happened last time? Last time we had Gwynplaine, who is also Lord Fermain, Clan Charlie, that we found out a couple readings ago, and he like wakes up and he realizes that he was stunned when Barkilphedro explained everything to him, and he's like, oh my god, what am I doing? I need to go and be with Dea, and I need to go and be with Ursus, my like actual family. So he gets up and he's like leaving, and we're getting elaborate descriptions of these rooms and how it's decorated and how like things are arranged and everything like that. And as he's leaving, he just gets lost. It's like a labyrinth of a place. The palace that he's staying at, which is his palace, he has no idea how to get out. And one of the doors he goes in, it has Hosiana sleeping, and he is a bit of a creep and just like watches her sleep, and a whole chapter is dedicated to just his thoughts about her and like everything like that. And then she like wakes up and he hides in the bathroom like a normal person, obviously, and she finds him there and is just like, "Oh, like, were you there when I was sleeping?" Blah blah blah. And then she just goes on like her rant of being like, "Oh, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread and you're a disgusting little mole, and like you're the fact that you're disgusting is what like makes me so attracted to you." And it's just very weird. And so Gwynplaine is like, I can't leave. This woman is too beautiful. Like the power that she has on me is just too intense for me to leave. And as they're like in an embrace, like they're hugging each other, then there's like a knock at the door and a letter is delivered to Hosiana, and Hosiana is like, read it to me. So he's reading the letter, and it's basically saying that Gwynplaine is Fermain Clan Charlie, and he will be marrying Lady Hosiana, not Lord David. That made it worded like he was going to marry Lord David. That's not what I meant. I meant Lord David is not going to be marrying Lady Hosiana. Gwynplaine is. And so Lady Hosiana is like stunned by this news. She rereads it herself and then is like, "Get out of here. You are my lover, or you are no longer my lover. You're my husband. I don't want anything to do with you," type of a thing. And so he's like, and doesn't leave. And she's like, "I will leave." And then she leaves the room. And I think that's where we left off. Let me double check though. Um, Oh no, that's not where we left off. Then, after all of that happens, he is like sworn in basically into being part of the aristocracy, and he has this person who is like telling him as he's going through the rooms like who everybody is, what their title is, and like how to greet everybody, like what the proper etiquette is and all of that. And there's a reading at the end, and bada boom bada bing, he is a royal now. And I think that's where we left off. Huh. So, part two, book the eighth, chapter two. There are 9 books total. So, we're making our way. Chapter two, impartiality. The creation of an equality with the king, called peerage, was, in barbarous epochs, a useful fiction. This rudimentary political expedient produced in France and England different results. In France, the peer was a mock king. In England, a real prince, less grand than in France, but more genuine. We might say less, but worse. Peerage was born in France. The date is uncertain. Under Charlemagne, says the legend. Under Robert le Sage, says history. And history is not more to be relied on than legend. Favin writes, "The King of France wished to attach to himself the great of his kingdom by the magnificent titles of peers, as if they were his equals." Peerage soon thrust forth branches, and from France passed over to England. The English peerage has been a great fact, and almost a mighty institution. It had for precedent the Saxon Wittenangemote, Wittangemote, the Danish Thane and the Norman Vavassor mingled in the Baron. Baron is the same as vir, which is translated into Spanish by varon, which signifies par excellence, man. As early as 1075, the barons made themselves felt by the king, and by what a king. In 1086, they laid the foundation of feudality and its basis on the Doomsday Book. Under John Lackland came conflict. The French peerage took the high hand with Great Britain and demanded that the King of England should appear at their bar. Great was the indignation of the English barons. At the coronation of Philip Augustus, the King of England, as Duke of Normandy, carried the first square banner, and the Duke of Guyenne the second. Against this king, a vassal of the foreigner, the War of the Barons burst forth. The barons imposed on the weak-minded King John Magna Charta, from which sprang the House of Lords. The Pope took part with the king and excommunicated the lords. The date was 1215, and the Pope was Innocent III, who wrote the Veni Sanctus Spiritus, and who sent to John Lackland the 4 cardinal virtues in the shape of 4 gold rings. The lords persisted. The duel continued through many generations. Pembroke struggled. 1248 was the year of the Provisions of Oxford. 24 barons limited the king's powers, discussed him, and called a knight from each county to take part in the widened breach. Here was the dawn of the Commons. Later on, the lords added 2 citizens from each city and 2 burgesses from each borough. It arose from this that up to the time of Elizabeth the peers were judges of the validity of elections to the House of Commons. From their jurisdiction sprang the proverb that the members returned ought to be without the 3 P's, sin prince, si precio, sin populo. This did not obviate rotten boroughs. In 1293, the Court of Peers in France had still the kings of England under their jurisdiction. The Philippe le Bel cited Edward I to appear before him. Edward I was the king who ordered his son to boil him down after death and to carry his bones to the war. Under the follies of their kings, the Lord felt the necessity of fortifying Parliament. They divided it into 2 chambers, the upper and the lower. The lords arrogantly kept the supremacy. If it happens that any member of the Commons should be so bold as to speak to the prejudice of the House of Lords, he is called to the bar of the House to be reprimanded, and occasionally to be sent to the Tower. There is the same distinction in voting. In the House of Lords they vote 1 by 1, beginning with the junior, called the Huisin Baron. Each peer answers content or non-content. In the Commons they vote together by aye or no in a crowd. The Commons accuse, the peers judge. The peers, in their disdain of figures, delegated to the Commons, who were to profit by it, the superintendence of the exchequer, thus named, according to some, after the table cover, which was like a chessboard, and according to others, from the drawers of the old safe, where was kept, behind an iron grating, the treasure of the kings of England. The year-book dates from the end of the 13th century. In the War of the Roses, the weight of the lords was thrown, now on the side of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, now on the side of Edmund, Duke of York. Wat Taylor, the Lollards, Warwick, the Kingmaker, all that anarchy from which freedom is to spring, had for foundation, avowed or secret, the English feudal system. The lords were usually jealous of the crown, for to be jealous is to be watchful. They circumscribed the royal initiative, diminished the category of cases of high treason, raised up pretended Richards against Henry IV, appointed themselves arbitrators, judged the question of the 3 crowns between the Duke of York and Margaret of Anjou, and at need levied armies and fought their battles of Shrewsbury, Tewkesbury, and St. Albans, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Before this, in the 13th century, they had gained the battle of Lewes, and had driven from the kingdom the 4 brothers of the king, bastards of Queen Isabella of the Count of La Marche, all 4 usurers who extorted money from Christians by means of Jewish folk. Half princes, half sharpers, a thing common enough in more recent times, but not held in good odor in those days. Up to the 15th century, the Norman Duke peeped out in the King of England, and the Acts of Parliament were written in French. From the reign of Henry VII, by the will of the Lords, though these were written in English. England, British under Uther Pendragon, Roman under Caesar, Saxon under the Heptarchy, Danish under Harold, Norman after William, then became, thanks to the Lords, English. After that, she became Anglican. To have one's religion at home is a great power. A foreign pope drags down the national life. A Mecca is an octopus and devours it. In 1534, London bowed out Rome. The peerage adopted the reformed religion, and the lords accepted Luther. Here we have the answer to the excommunication of 1215. It was agreeable to Henry VIII, but, in other respects, the lords were a trouble to him. As a bulldog to a bear, so was the House of Lords to Henry VIII. When Wolsey robbed the nation of Whitehall, and when Henry robbed Wolsey of it, who complained? 4 lords, Darcy of Chichester, St. John of Blethshill, and 2 Norman names, Mountjoy and Mounteagle, the king usurped. The peerage encroached. There is something in hereditary power which is incorruptible. Hence the insubordination of the lords. Even in Elizabeth's reign, the barons were restless. From this resulted the tortures at Durham. Elizabeth was as a farthingale over an executioner's block. Elizabeth assembled Parliament as seldom as possible, and reduced the House of Lords to 65 members, amongst whom there was but one Marquis, Winchester, and not a single Duke. In France, the kings felt the same jealousy, and carried out the same elimination. Under Henry III, there were no more than 8 dukedoms in the peerage, and it was to the great vexation of the king that the barons de Mance, the Baron de Courcy, the Baron de Coulommiers, the Baron de Chateauneuf un Thimeres, the Baron de la Fère and Lardinois, the Baron de Mortang, and some others besides, maintained themselves as barons, peers of France. In England, the crown saw the peerage diminish with pleasure. Under Anne, to quote but one example, the peerages became extinct since the 12th century amounted to 565. The War of the Roses had begun the extermination of dukes, which the Acts of Mary Tudor completed. This was, indeed, the decapitation of the nobility. To prune away the dukes was to cut off its head. Good policy, perhaps, but it is better to corrupt than to decapitate. James I was of this opinion. He restored dukedoms. He made a duke of his favorite Villiers, who had made him a pig, a transformation from the duke feudal to the duke courtier. And there is a note after, who made him a pig, and it says, Villiers called James I votre cochonnerie. I'm guessing that means pig. In French. This sowing was to bring forth a rank harvest. Charles II was to make 2 of his mistresses duchesses, Barbara of Southampton and Louise de la Correlle of Portsmouth. Under Anne, there were to be 25 dukes, of whom 3 were to be foreigners, Cumberland, Cambridge, and Schomberg. Did this court policy, invented by James I, succeed? No. The House of Peers was irritated by the effort to shackle it by intrigue. It was irritated against James the First. It was irritated against Charles the First, who, we may observe, may have had something to do with the death of his father, just as Marie de Medici may have had something to do with the death of her husband. There was a rupture between Charles the First and the peerage. The lords who, under James the First, had tried at their bar extortion in the person of Bacon, under Charles the First, tried treason in the person of Stratford. They had condemned Bacon. They condemned Stratford. One had lost his honor. The other lost his life. Charles the First was first beheaded in the person of Stratford. The lords lent their aid to the commons. The king convokes Parliament to Oxford. The Revolution convokes it to London. 44 peers side with the king, 24 in the Republic. From this combination of the people with the lords arose the Bill of Rights, a sketch of the French droit de l'homme, a vague shadow flung back from the depths of futurity by the Revolution of France on the Revolution of England. Such were the services of the peerage, involuntary ones, we admit, and dearly purchased. Because the said peerage is a huge parasite, but considerable services nevertheless. The despotic work of Louis the XI, of Richelieu, of Louis XIV, the creation of a sultan, leveling taken for true equality, the bastinado given by the scepter, the common abasement of the people. All these Turkish tricks in France the peers prevented in England. The aristocracy was a wall, banking up the king on one side, sheltering the people on the other. They redeemed their arrogance towards the people by their insolence towards the king. Simon, Earl of Leicester, said to Henry III, "King, thou hast lied." The lords curbed the crown and grated against their kings in the tenderest point, that of venery. Every lord, passing through a royal park, had the right to kill a deer. In the house of the king the peer was at home. In the Tower of London the scale of allowance for the king was no more than that for a peer, namely, 12 pounds sterling per week. This was the House of Lords' doing. Yet more, we owe it to the deposition of kings. The lords ousted John Lackland, degraded Edward II, deposed Richard II, broke the power of Henry VI, and made Cromwell a possibility. What a Louis XIV there was in Charles I. Thanks to Cromwell, it remained latent. By the by, we may here observe that Cromwell himself, though no historian seems to have noticed the fact, aspired to the peerage. This was why he married Elizabeth Bouchier, descendant and heiress of a Cromwell, Lord Bouchier, whose peerage became extinct in 1471, and of a Bouchier, Lord Robsart, another peerage extinct in 1429. Carried on with the formidable increase of important events, he found the suppression of a king a shorter way to power than the recovery of a peerage. A ceremonial of the lords, at times ominous, could reach even to the king. 2 men-at-arms from the Tower, with their axes on their shoulders, between whom an accused peer stood at the bar of the house, might have been there in like attendance on the king as on any other nobleman. For 5 centuries the House of Lords acted on a system, and carried it out with determination. They had their days of idleness and weakness, as, for instance, that strange time when they allowed themselves to be seduced by the vessels loaded with cheeses, hams, and Greek wines sent them by Julius II. The English aristocracy was restless, haughty, ungovernable, watchful, and patriotically mistrustful. It was that aristocracy which, at the end of the 17th century, by Act the 10th of the year 1694, derived the borough of Stockbridge, in Hampshire, of the right of sending members to Parliament, and forced the Commons to declare null the election for that borough, stained by papistical fraud. It imposed the test on James, Duke of York, and, on his refusal to take it, excluded him from the throne. He reigned, notwithstanding, but the Lords wound up by calling him to account and banishing him. That aristocracy has had, in its long duration, some instinct of progress. It has always given out a certain quantity of appreciable light, except now towards its end, which is at hand. Under James II, it maintained in the lower house the proportion of 346 burgesses against 92 knights. The 16 barons, by courtesy, in the Cinque Ports, were more than counterbalanced by the 50 citizens of the 25 cities. Though corrupt and egotistic that aristocracy was, in some instances, singularly impartial. It is harshly judged. History keeps all its compliments for the commons. The justice of this is doubtful. We consider the part played by the lords a very great one. Oligarchy is the independence of a barbarous state, but it is an independence. Take Poland, for instance, nominally a kingdom, really a republic. The peers of England held the throne in suspicion and guardianship. Time after time, they have made their power more felt than that of the commons. They gave check to the king. Thus, in that remarkable year, 1694, the Triennial Parliament Bill, rejected by the Commons, in consequence of the objections of William III, was passed by the Lords. William III, in his irritation, deprived the Earl of Bath of the governorship of Pendennis Castle, and Viscount Mordaunt of all his offices. The House of Lords was the Republic of Venice in the heart of the royalty of England. To reduce the king to a doge was its object, and in proportion as it decreased the power of the crown, it increased that of the people. Royalty knew this, and hated the peerage. Each endeavored to lessen the other. What was thus lost by each was proportionate profit to the people. Those two blind powers, monarchy and oligarchy, could not see that they were working for the benefit of a third, which was democracy. What a delight it was to the crown in the last century to be able to hang a peer, Lord Ferrers. However, they hung him with a silken rope. How polite. They would not have hung a peer of France, the Duke of Richelieu haughtily remarked. Granted. They would have beheaded him. Still more polite. Montmorency Tancarville signed himself peer of France and England, thus throwing the English peerage into the second rank. The peers of France were higher and less powerful, holding to rank more than to authority, and to precedence more than to domination. There was between them and the lords that shade of difference which separates vanity from pride. With the peers of France, to take precedence of foreign princes, of Spanish grandees, of Venetian patricians, to see seated on the lower benches the marshals of France, the constable and the admiral of France, were he even Comte de Toulouse and son of Louis XIV. To draw a distinction between duchies in the male and female line, to maintain the proper distance between a simple comte like Armagnac or Albret and the Comte Paris like Evreux, to wear by right at 25 the blue ribbon of the Golden Fleece, to counterbalance the Duc de la Tremoille, the most ancient peer of the court, with Duke Uzès, the most ancient peer of the Parliament, to claim as many pages and horses to their carriages as an elector, to be called Monseigneur by the first president, to discuss whether the Duc de Maine dates his peerage as the Comte d'Eu from 1458. To cross the Grand Chamber diagonally, or by the side, such things were grave matters. Grave matters with the Lords were the Navigation Act, the Test Act, the enrollment of Europe in the service of England, the Comrade of the Sea, the expulsion of the Stuarts, war with France. On one side, etiquette above all; on the other, empire above all. The peers of England had the substance, the peers of France the shadow. To conclude, the House of Lords was a starting point. Towards civilization, this is an immense thing. It had the honor to found a nation. It was the first incarnation of the unity of people. English resistance, that obscure but all-powerful force, was born in the House of Lords. The Baron, by a series of acts of violence against royalty, have paved the way for its eventual downfall. The House of Lords at the present day is somewhat sad and astonished at what it has unwillingly and unintentionally done, all the more that it is irrevocable. What are concessions? Restitutions, and nations know it. "I grant," says the king. "I get back my own," says the people. The House of Lords believed that it was creating the privileges of the peerage, and it has produced the rights of the citizen. That vulture aristocracy has hatched the eagle's egg of liberty. And now the egg is broken. The eagle is soaring, the vulture dying. Aristocracy is at its last gasp. England is growing up. Still, let us be just towards the aristocracy. It entered the scale against royalty, and was its counterpoise. It was an obstacle to despotism. It was a barrier. Let us thank and bury it. End of chapter 2. Okay, so that one was just like a history dump. It was a huge history dump on the peerage, the importance of the peerage from when it started, and how it has sort of evolved, and how we went from monarchy to oligarchy, and how there's this thing called democracy just waiting in the wings. And did we write down all the names? Are we going to remember them? Absolutely not. Chapter 3. The Old Hall. Near Westminster Abbey was an old Norman palace which was burnt in the time of Henry VIII. Its wings were spared. In one of them Edward VI placed the House of Lords, in the other the House of Commons. Neither the two wings nor the two chambers are now in existence. The whole has been rebuilt. We have already said, and we must repeat, that there is no resemblance between the House of Lords of the present day and that of the past. In demolishing the ancient palace, they somewhat demolish its ancient usages. The strokes of the pickaxe on the monument produce their counterstrokes on customs and charters. An old stone cannot fall without dragging down with it an old law. Place in a round room a parliament which has been hitherto held in a square room, and it will no longer be the same thing. A change in the shape of the shell changes the shape of the fish inside. If you wish to preserve an old thing, human or divine, a code or a dogma, a nobility or a priesthood, never repair anything about it thoroughly, even its outside cover. Patch it up, nothing more. For instance, Jesuitism is a piece added to Catholicism. Treat edifices as you would treat institutions. Shadows should dwell in ruins. Worn-out powers are uneasy in chambers freshly decorated. Ruined palaces accord best with institutions in rags. To attempt to describe the House of Lords of other days would be to attempt to describe the unknown. History is night. In history there is no second tier. That which is no longer on the stage immediately fades into obscurity. The scene is shifted, and all is at once forgotten. The past has a synonym: the unknown. The peers of England sat as a court of justice in Westminster Hall, and as the higher legislative chamber in a chamber specially reserved for the purpose, called the House of Lords. Besides the House of Peers of England, which did not assemble as a court unless convoked by the Crown, two great English tribunals, inferior to the House of Peers, but superior to all other jurisdiction, sat in Westminster Hall. At the end of that hall they occupied adjoining compartments. The first was the Court of King's Bench, in which the king was supposed to preside; the second, the Court of Chancery, in which the chancellor presided. The one was a court of justice, the other a court of mercy. It was the chancellor who counseled the king to pardon, only rarely, though. These two courts, which are still in existence, interpreted legislation and reconstructed it somewhat, for the art of the judge is to carve the code into jurisprudence, a task from which equity results as it best may. Legislation was worked up and applied in the severity of the great hall of Westminster, the rafters of which were of chestnut wood, over which spiders could not spread their webs. There are enough of them in all conscience of the law. To sit as a court and to sit as a chamber are two distinct things. This double function constitutes supreme power. The long Parliament, which began in November 1640, felt the revolutionary necessity for this two-edged sword, so it declared that, as House of Lords, it possessed judicial as well as legislative power. This double power has been, from time immemorial, vested in the House of Peers. We have just mentioned that as judges they occupied Westminster Hall; as legislators they had another chamber. This other chamber, properly called the House of Lords, was oblong and narrow. All the light in it came from 4 windows in deep embrasures, which received their light through the roof, and a bull's eye, composed of 6 panes with curtains over the throne. At night there was no other light than 12 half candelabra fastened to the wall. The chamber of Venice was darker still. A certain obscurity is pleasing to those owls of supreme power. A high ceiling adorned with many-faced relievos and gilded cornices circled over the chamber where the lords assembled. The Commons had but a flat ceiling. There is a meaning in all monarchical buildings. At one end of the long chamber of the Lords was the door. At the other, opposite to it, the throne. A few paces from the door, the bar, a transverse barrier, and a sort of frontier, marked the spot where the people ended and the peerage began. To the right of the throne was a fireplace with emblazoned pinnacles and 2 bas-reliefs of marble, representing, one, the victory of Cuthwolf over the Britons in 572, the other, the geometrical plan of the borough of Dunstable, which had 4 streets parallel to the 4 quarters of the world. The throne was approached by 3 steps. It was called the Royal Chair. On the 2 walls opposite each other were displayed in successive pictures on a huge piece of tapestry given to the lords by Elizabeth, the adventures of the Armada, from the time of its leaving Spain until it was wrecked on the coasts of Great Britain. The great hulls of the ship were embroidered with threads of gold and silver, which had become darkened by time. Against this tapestry, cut at intervals by the candelabra fastened in the wall, were placed, to the right of the throne, 3 rows of benches for the bishops, and to the left 3 rows of benches for the dukes, marquises, and earls, in tiers and separated by gangways. On the 3 benches of the first section sat the dukes, on those of the second the marquises, on those of the third the earls. The viscount's bench was placed across, opposite the throne, and behind, between the viscounts and the bar, were 2 benches for the barons. On the highest bench to the right of the throne sat the 2 archbishops of Canterbury and York. On the middle bench 3 bishops, London, Durham, and Winchester, and the other bishops on the lowest bench. There is between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the other bishops this considerable difference, that he is bishop by divine providence, whilst the others are only so by divine permission. On the right of the throne was a chair for the Prince of Wales, and on the left folding chairs for the royal dukes, and behind the latter a raised seat for minor peers, who had not the privilege of voting. Plenty of fleur-de-lis everywhere, and the great escutcheon of England over the 4 walls, above the peers as well as above the king. The sons of peers and the heirs to peerages assisted at the debates, standing behind the throne, between the dais and the wall. A large square space was left vacant between the tiers of benches placed along 3 sides of the chamber and the throne. In this space, which was covered with the state carpet, interwoven with the arms of Great Britain, were 4 woolsacks, one in front of the throne, on which sat the Lord Chancellor, between the mace and the seal; one in front of the bishops, on which sat the judges, councillors of state, who had the right to vote, but not to speak; one in front of the dukes, marquises, and earls, on which sat the secretaries of state; and one in front of the viscounts and barons, on which sat the clerk of the crown and the clerk of the parliament, and on which the 2 under-clerks wrote, kneeling. In the middle of the space was a large covered table, heaped with bundles of papers, registers, and summonses, with magnificent inkstains of chased silver, and with high candlesticks at the 4 corners. The peers took their seats in chronological order, each according to the date of the creation of his peerage. They ranked according to their titles, and within their grade of nobility according to seniority. At the bar stood the usher of the black rod, his wand in his hand. Inside the door was the deputy usher, and outside the crier of the black rod, whose duty it was to open the sittings of the courts of justice with the cry, Oyez, in French, uttered thrice with a solemn accent upon the first syllable. Near the crier stood the sergeant mace-bearer of the chancellor. In royal ceremonies, this temporal peers wore coronets on their heads, and the spiritual peers mitres. The archbishops wore mitres with a ducal coronet, and the bishops who rank after viscounts mitres with baron's cap. It is to be remarked, as a coincidence at once strange and instructive, that this square formed by the throne, the bishops and the barons, with kneeling magistrates within it, was in form similar to the ancient parliament in France, under the 2 first dynasties. The aspect of authority was the same in France as in England. Hincmar, in his treatise, described in 853 the sittings of the House of Lords at Westminster in the 18th century. Strange indeed, a description given 900 years before the existence of the thing described. But what is history? An echo of the past in the future, a reflex from the future on the past. The Assembly of Parliament was obligatory only once in every 7 years. The Lords deliberated in secret, with closed doors. The debates of the Commons were public. Publicity entails diminution of dignity. The number of the Lords was unlimited. To create Lords was the menace of royalty, a means of government. At the beginning of the 18th century, the House of Lords already contained a very large number of members. It has increased still further since that period. To dilute the aristocracy is politic. Elizabeth most probably erred in condensing the peerage into 65 lords. The less numerous, the more intense is a peerage. In assemblies, the fewer the heads. James II understood this when he increased the upper house to 188 lords, 186 if we subtract from the peerages the two duchies of royal favorites, Portsmouth and Cleveland. Under Anne, the total number of the lords, including bishops, was 207. Not counting the Duke of Cumberland, husband of the Queen, there were 25 dukes, of whom the Premier Norfolk did not take his seat, being a Catholic, and of whom the junior, Cambridge, the Elector of Hanover, did, although a foreigner. Winchester, termed first and sole Marquis of England, as Astorga was termed sole Marquis of Spain, was absent, being a Jacobite, so that there were only 5 marquises, of whom the premier was Lindsay and the junior Lothian, 79 earls, of whom Derby was premier and Ely, junior, 9 viscounts, of whom Hereford was premier and Lonsdale junior, and 62 barons, of whom Abergavenny was premier and Hervey junior. Lord Hervey, the junior baron, was what was called the Usney of the house. Derby, of whom Oxford, Shrewsbury, and Kent took precedence, and who was therefore but the fourth under James II, became, under Anne, premier earl. 2 chancellors' names had disappeared from the list of barons. Verulam, under which designation history finds us Bacon, and Wem, under which it finds us Jeffreys. Bacon and Jeffreys, both names overshadowed, though by different crimes. In 1705, the 26 bishops were reduced to 25, the see of Chester being vacant. Amongst the bishops, some were peers of high rank, such as William Talbot, Bishop of Oxford, who was head of the Protestant branch of that family. Others were eminent doctors, like John Sharp, Archbishop of York, formerly Dean of Norwich. The poet, Thomas Sprat, Bishop of Rochester, an apoplectic old man, and that Bishop of Lincoln, who was to die Archbishop of Canterbury, Wake, the adversary of Bossuet, on important occasions, and when a message from the crown to the house was expected, the whole of this august assembly, in robes, in wigs, in mitres or plumes, formed out and displayed their rows of heads in tiers along the walls of the house, where the storm was vaguely to be seen exterminating the armada, almost as much to say, the storm is at the orders of England. End of chapter 3. We got all that. We know where everybody sits. We know how many of each tier in the peerage there are. Got it? Just lots of context. Just lots of context. No big deal. Chapter 4. The Old Chamber. The whole ceremony of the investiture of Gwynplaine, from his entry under the king's gate to his taking the test under the nave window, was enacted in a sort of twilight. Lord William Cowper had not permitted that he, as Lord Chancellor of England, should receive too many details of circumstances connected with the disfigurement of the young Lord Fermain Clancharlie, who is Gwynplaine. Considering it below his dignity to know that a peer was not handsome, and feeling that his dignity would suffer if an inferior should venture to intrude on him information of such a nature. We know that a common fellow will take pleasure in saying, that prince is humpbacked. Therefore it is abusive to say that a lord is deformed. To the few words dropped on the subject by the Queen, the Lord Chancellor had contented himself with replying, "The face of a peer is in his peerage." Ultimately, however, the affidavits he had read and certified enlightened him. Hence the precautions which he took. The face of the new lord on his entrance into the house might cause some sensation. This it was necessary to prevent, and the Lord Chancellor took his measures for the purpose. It is a fixed idea and a rule of conduct in grave personages to allow as little disturbance as possible. Dislike of incident is a part of their gravity. He felt the necessity of so ordering matters that the admission of Gwynplaine should take place without any hitch, and like that of any other successor to the peerage. It was for this reason that the Lord Chancellor directed that the reception of Lord Fermain Clancharlie should take place at the evening sitting, the Chancellor being the doorkeeper, quomodo austerius, says the Norman Charter, Januarum Chancellorumque, says Tertullian. He can't officiate outside the room on the threshold, and Lord William Cowper had used his right by carrying out under the nave the formalities of the investiture of Lord Fermain Clancharlie. Moreover, he had brought forward the hour for the ceremonies, so that the new peer actually made his entrance into the house before the house had assembled. For the investiture of a peer on the threshold, and not in the chamber itself, there were precedents. The first hereditary baron, John de Beauchamp of Holt Castle, created by patent by Richard II in 1387. Baron Kidderminster was thus installed. In renewing this precedent, the Lord Chancellor was creating for himself a future cause for embarrassment, of which he felt the inconvenience less than 2 years afterwards on the entrance of Viscount Newhaven into the House of Lords. Short-sighted as we have already stated him to be, Lord William Cowper scarcely perceived the deformity of Gwynplaine, while the two sponsors, being old and nearly blind, did not perceive it at all. The old Chancellor had chosen them for that very reason. More than this, the Lord Chancellor, having only seen the presence and stature of Gwynplaine, thought him a fine-looking man. When the doorkeeper opened the folding doors to Gwynplaine, there were but few peers in the house, and these few were nearly all old men. In assemblies, the old members are the most punctual, just as towards women they are the most assiduous. On the Duke's benches there were but two, one white-headed, the other grey. Thomas Osborne, Duke of Leeds and Schomberg, son of that Schomberg, German by birth, French by his marshal's baton, and English by his peerage, who was banished by the Edict of Nantes, and who, having fought against England as a Freshman, fought against France as an Englishman. On the benches of the Lords Spiritual there sat the only Bishop of Canterbury, Primate of England above and below, Dr. Simon Patrick, Bishop of Ely, in conversation with Evelyn Pierrepont, Marquis of Dorchester, who was explaining to him the difference between a gabion considered singly and when used in the parapet of a field work, and between palisades and phrases, the former being a row of posts driven info the ground in front of the tents for the purpose of protecting the camp. The latter sharp-pointed stakes set up under the wall of the fortress to prevent the escalade of the besiegers and the desertion of the besieged, and the Marquis was explaining further the method of placing phrases in the ditches of redoubts, half of each stake being buried and half exposed. Thomas Thane, Viscount Weymouth, having approached the light of the chandelier, was examining a plan for his architects for laying out his gardens at Longleat, in Wiltshire, in the Italian style, as broken up into plots with squares of turf alternating with squares of red and yellow sand, of river shells, and of fine coal dust. On the Viscount's benches was a group of old peers, Essex, Asolstone, Peregrine, Osborne, William Zulestein, Earl of Rochford, and amongst them a few more youthful ones of the faction which did not wear wigs, gathered round Prince Devereux, Viscount Hereford, and discussing the question whether an infusion of alpaca holly was tea. "Very nearly," said Osborne. "Quite," said Essex. This discussion was attentively listened to by Paulette St. John, a cousin of Bolingbroke, of whom Voltaire was, later on, in some degree the pupil, for Voltaire's education, commenced by Père Poiret, was finished by Bolingbroke. On the Marquis's benches, Thomas de Grey, Marquis of Kent, Lord Chamberlain to the Queen, was informing Robert Bertie, Marquis of Lindsay, Lord Chamberlain of England, that the first prize in the great English lottery of 1694 had been won by two French refugees, Monsieur Lecoq, formerly councillor in the Parliament of Paris, and Monsieur Ravenel, a gentleman of Brittany. The Earl of Wemyss was reading a book entitled Pratique Cursus d'Orcels Disciples. John Campbell, Earl of Greenwich, famous for his long chin, his gaiety, and his 87 years, was writing to his mistress. Lord Chandos was trimming his nails. The sitting which was about to take place being a royal one, where the crown was to be represented by commissioners, two assistant doorkeepers were placing in front of the throne a bench covered with purple velvet. On the second woolsack sat the master of the rolls, Sacrorum Scriptorium Magister, who had then for his residence the house formerly belonging to the converted Jews. Two under-clerks were kneeling and turning over the leaves of the registers, which lay on the fourth woolsack. In the meantime, the Lord Chancellor took his place on the first woolsack. The members of the chamber took theirs, some sitting, others standing, when the Archbishop of Canterbury rose and read the prayer, and the sitting of the House began. Gwynplaine had already been there for some time without attracting any notice. The second bench of barons, on which was his place, was close to the bar, so that he had had to take but a few steps to reach it. The two peers, his sponsors, sat, one on his right, the other on his left, thus almost concealing the presence of the newcomer. No one having been furnished with any previous information, the clerk of the Parliament had read in a low voice, and, as it were, mumbled through the different documents concerning the new peer, and the Lord Chancellor had proclaimed his admission in the midst of what is called in the reports general inattention. Everyone was talking. There buzzed through the house that cheerful hum of voices during which assemblies pass things which will not bear the light, and at which they wonder when they find out what they have done too late. Gwynplaine was seated in silence, with his head uncovered, between the two old peers, Lord Fitzwalter and Lord Arundel. On entering, according to the instructions of the King-at-Arms, afterwards renewed by his sponsors, he had bowed to the throne. Thus all was over. He was a peer. That pinnacle under the glory of which he had, all his life, seen his master Ursus bow himself down in fear, that prodigious pinnacle was under his feet. He was in that place so dark and yet so dazzling in England. Old peak of the feudal mountain, looked up to for 6 centuries by Europe and by history. Terrible nimbus of a world of shadow, he had entered into the brightness of its glory, and his entrance was irrevocable. He was there in his own sphere, seated on his crown, like the king on his. He was there, and nothing in the future could obliterate the fact. The royal crown, which he saw under the dais, was brother to his coronet. He was a peer of that throne. In the face of majesty he was peerage, less, but like. Yesterday what was he? A player. Today, what was he? A prince. Yesterday nothing, today everything. It was a sudden confrontation of misery and power, meeting face to face and resolving themselves at once into the two halves of conscience. Two specters, adversity and prosperity, were taking possession of the same soul, and each drawing that soul towards itself. Oh, pathetic division of an intellect, of a will, of a brain, between two brothers who are enemies, the phantom of poverty and the phantom of wealth, Abel and Cain in the same man. End of chapter 4. Okay, so in this one we do get more history and we get more seeding, and we also are getting back to our story by being like, yeah, all of this is insane and crazy and there's so much pomp and circumstance, and Gwynplaine's here. Remember Gwynplaine? Remember that he's now part of the aristocracy? Yeah, he doesn't understand it either, just like us. He has advisors that tell him where to go, what to say, who is who, all of these things. And I feel like I would be just as lost as Gwynplaine in this insane new world that he's now part of. And he mentions it in a couple different ways, but like yesterday he was Gwynplaine. He was nobody. People knew him as the Laughing Man and nothing else. He had no power. He, was performing for food and for money. And now he pretty much doesn't have to do anything ever again and just be perfectly fine. So that's cool. All right. Chapter 5. Aristocratic Gossip. By degrees, the seats of the house filled as the lords arrived. The question was the vote for augmenting, by 100,000 pounds sterling, the annual income of George of Denmark, Duke of Cumberland, the Queen's husband. Besides this, it was announced that several bills assented to by Her Majesty were to be brought back to the House by the commissioners of the Crown, empowered and charged to sanction them. This raised the sitting to a royal one. The peers all wore their robes over their usual court or ordinary dress. These robes, similar to that which had been thrown over Gwynplaine, were alike for all, excepting that the dukes had 5 bands of ermine, trimmed with gold, marquises 4, earls and viscounts 3, and barons 2. Most of the lords entered in groups. They had met in the corridors and were continuing the conversations there begun. A few came in alone. The costumes of all were solemn, but neither their attitudes nor their words corresponded with them. On entering, each one bowed to the throne. The peers flowed in. The series of great names marched past with scant ceremonial, the public not being present. Leicester entered and shook Lichfield's hand. Then came Charles Mordaunt, Earl of Peterborough and Monmouth, the friend of Locke, under whose advice he had proposed the recoinage of money. Then Charles Campbell, Earl of Lowdown, listening to Fulk Greville, Lord Brooke. Then Dorm, Earl of Carnarvon. Then Robert Sutton, Baron Lexington, son of that Lexington who recommended Charles II to banish Gregorio Leti, the historiographer, who was so ill-advised as to try to become a historian. Then Thomas Bellasis, Viscount Falkenberg, a handsome old man, and the 3 cousins, Howard, Earl of Bindon, Bowes Howard, Earl of Berkshire, and Stafford Howard, Earl of Stafford, altogether. Then John Lovelace, Baron Lovelace, which peerage became extinct in 1736, so that Richardson was enabled to introduce Lovelace in his book, and to create a type under the name. All these personages celebrated each in his own way, either in politics or in war, and of whom many were in honor to England, or laughing and talking. It was history, as it were seen in undress. In less than half an hour the house was nearly full. This was to be expected, as the sitting was a royal one. What was more unusual was the eagerness of the conversations. The house, so sleepy not long before, now hummed like a hive of bees. The arrival of the peers who had come in late had wakened them up. These lords had brought news. It was strange that the peers who had been there at the opening of the sitting knew nothing of what had occurred, while those who had not been there knew all about it. Several lords had come from Windsor. For some hours past the adventures of Gwynplaine had been the subject of conversation. A secret is a net. Let one mesh drop, and the whole goes to pieces. In the morning, in consequence of the incidents related above, the whole story of a peer found on the stage and of a mountebank become a lord had burst forth at Windsor in royal places. The princes had talked about it, and then the lackeys. From the court the news soon reached the town. Events have a weight, and the mathematical rule of velocity increasing in proportion to the squares of the distance applies to them. They fall upon the public, and work themselves through it with the most astounding rapidity. At 7 o'clock, no one in London had caught wind of the story. By 8, Gwynplaine was the talk of the town. Only the lords who had been so punctual that they were present before the assembling of the house were ignorant of the circumstances, not having been in the town when the matter was talked of by everyone, and having been in the house where nothing had been perceived. Seated quietly on their benches, they were addressed by the eager newcomer. "Well," said Francis Brown, Viscount Montacute, to the Marquis of Dorchester. "What? Is it possible?" "What?" "The Laughing Man." Who is the Laughing Man?" "Don't you know the Laughing Man?" "No." "He's a clown, a fellow performing at fairs. He has an extraordinary face, which people gave a penny to look at." Well, what then?" "You have just installed him as a peer of England." "You are the Laughing Man, my Lord Montacute." "I am not laughing, my Lord Dorchester." Lord Montacute made a sign to the clerk of the Parliament, who rose from his woolsack, and confirmed to their lordships the fact of the admission of the new peer. Besides, he detailed the circumstances. "How wonderful!" said Lord Dorchester. "I was talking to the Bishop of Ely on the while." The young Earl... Wait, is that the right one? Yes, okay. The young Earl of Annesley addressed old Lord Ure, who had but 2 years more to live, as he died in 1707. "My Lord Ure, my Lord Annesley, did you know Lord Linnaeus Clancharlie?" "A man of bygone days. Yes, I did. He died in Switzerland?" "Yes, we were relations." "He was a Republican under Cromwell, and remained a Republican under Charles II?" "A Republican? Not at all. He was sulking. He had a personal quarrel with the king. I know from good authority that Lord Clancharlie would have returned to his allegiance if they had given him the office of Chancellor, which Lord Hyde held." "You astonish me, Lord Ure. I had heard that Lord Clancharlie was an honest politician." "An honest politician? Does such a thing exist? Young man, there is no such thing." "And Cato?" "Oh, you believe in Cato, do you?" "And Aristides?" "They did well to exile him." "And Thomas More?" "They did well to cut off his head." And in your opinion, Lord Clancharlie was a man as you describe. As for a man remaining in exile, why, it is simply ridiculous. Oh, he died there. An ambitious man, disappointed. You ask if I knew him. I should think so indeed. I was his dearest friend. Do you know, Lord Ure, that he married when in Switzerland? I am pretty sure of it. And that he had a lawful heir by that marriage. Yes, who is dead. Who is living. Living? Living. Impossible. It is a fact, proved, authenticated, confirmed, registered. Then that son will inherit the Clancharlie peerage? He's not going to inherit it. Why? Because he has inherited it. It is done. Done? Turn your head, Lord Ure. He is sitting behind you on the Baron's benches. Lord Ure turned, but Gwynplaine's face was concealed under his forest of hair. So, said the old man, who could see nothing but his hair, he has already adopted the new fashion. He does not wear a wig. Grantham accosted Culpepper. Someone is finely sold. Who is that? David Deary Muir. How is that? He is no longer a peer. How can that be? And Henry Averky, Earl of Grantham, told John Baron Culpepper the whole anecdote, how the waif flask had been carried to the Admiralty, about the parchment of the Comprachicos, the Jusurigis countersigned Jeffreys, and the confrontation in the torture cell at Southwark, the proof of all the facts acknowledged by the Lord Chancellor and by the Queen, the taking the test under the nave, and finally the admission of Lord Fermain Clancharlie at the commencement of the sitting. Both the lords endeavoured to distinguish his face as he sat between Lord Fitzwalter and Lord Arundel, but with no better success than Lord Ure and Lord Annesley. Gwynplaine, either by chance or by the arrangement of his sponsors, forewarned by the Lord Chancellor, was so placed in shadow as to escape their curiosity. Who is it? Where is he? Such was the exclamation of all the newcomers, but no one succeeded in making him out distinctly. Some who had seen Gwynplaine in the Green Box were exceedingly curious, but lost their labour, as it sometimes happens that a young lady is entrenched within a troop of dowagers. Gwynplaine was, as it were, enveloped in several layers of lords, old, infirm, and indifferent. Good livers with the gout are marvellously indifferent to stories about their neighbours. There passed from hand to hand copies of a letter 3 lines in length, written, it was said, by the Duchess Josiana to the Queen, her sister, in answer to the injunction made by Her Majesty that she should espouse the new peer, the lawful heir of the Clancharlies, Lord Fermain. This letter was couched in the following terms: Madam, the arrangement will suit me just as well. I can have Lord David for my lover. Signed, Hosiana. This note, whether a true copy or a forgery, was received by all with the greatest enthusiasm. A young lord, Charles Okehampton, Baron Mohun, was believed to the wigless faction, read and reread it with delight. Louis de Duras, Earl of Faversham, an Englishman with a Frenchman's wit, looked at Mohun and smiled. "That is a woman I should like to marry," exclaimed Lord Mohun. The lords around them overheard the following dialogue between Duras and Mohun. "Marry the Duchess, Hosiana, Lord Mohun." "Why not? Plague take it. She would make one very happy. She would make many very happy. But is it not always a question of many?" "Lord Mohun, you are right. With regard to women, we have always the leavings of others. Has anyone ever had a beginning?" "Adam, perhaps." "Not he." "Then Satan. My dear lord," concluded Louis Duras. Adam only lent his name, poor dupe. He endorsed the human race. Man has begotten on the woman by the devil. Hugh Cholmondeley, Earl of Cholmondeley, strong in points of law, was asked from the bishop's benches by Nathaniel Crewe, who was doubly a peer, being a temporal peer as Baron Crewe and a spiritual peer as Bishop of Durham. "Is it possible?" said Crewe. "Is it regular?" said Cholmondeley. "The investiture of this peer was made outside the house," replied the bishop, "but it is stated that there are precedents for it." "Yes, Lord Beauchamp under Richard II, Lord Cheney under Elizabeth, and Lord Roghill under Cromwell." "Cromwell goes for nothing." "What do you think of it all?" "Many different things." "My Lord Cholmondeley, what will be the rank of this young Lord Clancharlie in the house?" "My Lord Bishop, the interruption of the Republic having displaced ancient rights of precedence, Clancharlie now ranks in the peerage between Barnard and Somers, so that should each be called upon to speak in turn, Lord Clancharlie would be the 8th in rotation." "Really? He, a mountebank from a public show?" "The act per se does not astonish me, my Lord Bishop. We meet with such things. Still more wonderful circumstances occur. Was not the War of the Roses predicted by the sudden drying up of the river Ouse in Bedfordshire on January 1st, 1399? Now, if a river dries up, a peer may quite as naturally fall into a servile condition. Ulysses, king of Ithaca, played all kinds of different parts. Fermain Clancharlie remained a lord under his player's garb. Sordid garments touch not the soul's nobility. But taking the test and the investiture outside the sitting, though strictly legal, might give rise to objections. I am of opinion that it will be necessary to look into the matter, to see if there be any ground to question the Lord Chancellor in Privy Council later on. We shall see in a week or two what is best to be done." And the bishop added, "All the same, it is an adventure such as has not occurred since Earl Gebodis's." Gwynplaine, the Laughing Man, the Tadcaster Inn, the Green Box, Chaos Vanquished, Switzerland, Chillon, the Comprachicos, Exile, Mutilation, the Republic, Jeffreys, James II, Jusso Regis, the Bottle Opened at the Admiralty, the Father, Lord Linnaeus, the Legitimate Son, Lord Fermain, the Bastard Son, Lord David, the Probable Lawsuits, the Duchess Hosiana, the Lord Chancellor, the Queen. All these subjects of conversation ran from bench to bench. Whispering is like a train of gunpowder. They seized on every incident. All the details of the occurrence caused an immense murmur through the house. Gwynplaine, wandering in the depths of his reverie, heard the buzzing, without knowing that he was the cause of it. He was strangely attentive to the depths, not the surface. Excess of attention becomes isolation. The buzz of conversation in the house impedes its usual business no more than the dust raised by a troop impedes its march. The judges, who in the upper house were mere assistants, without the privilege of speaking, except when questioned, had taken their places on the second woolsack, and the 3 secretaries of state theirs on the third. The airs of peerages flowed into their compartment, at once without and within the house, at the back of the throne. The peers in their minority were on their own benches. In 1705, the number of these little lords amounted to no less than a dozen. Huntington, Lincoln, Dorset, Warwick, Bath, Barlington, Derwentwater, destined to a tragical death, Longview, Lonsdale, Dudley, Ward, and Carteret. A troop of brats made up of 8 earls, 2 viscounts, and 2 barons. All were in order according to right of precedence. Cavendish, Duke of Devonshire, whose grandfather had sheltered Hobbes at Hardwicke when he was 92. Lennox, Duke of Richmond, the three Fitzroys, the Duke of Southampton, the Duke of Grafton, and the Duke of Northumberland. Butler, Duke of Ormond, Somerset, Duke of Beaufort, Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, Paulet, Duke of Bolton, Osborne, Duke of Leeds, Wriothesley Russell, Duke of Bedford, whose motto and device was Che Sera Sera, which expresses a determination to take things as they come. Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham, Manners, Duke of Rutland, and others. Neither Howard, Duke of Norfolk, nor Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, were present, being Catholics, nor Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, the French Malbrook, who was at that time fighting the French and beating them. There were no Scotch dukes then. Queensberry, Montrose, and Roxburgh were not admitted till 1707. End of chapter 5. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 5, and it was all about rumors. So people just talking about Gwynplaine and the weirdness of like his dad, Linnaeus Clancharlie, going off to Switzerland, getting married, having a kid, everything, that Gwynplaine was a performer before all of this, that he's deformed by the comprachicos and everything, and all of these whispers are happening around Gwynplaine. And Gwynplaine is like knows that whispers are happening, but doesn't know that they're about him. Got it. Okay. Chapter 6. The high and the low. All at once a bright light broke forth. Nope. All at once a bright light broke upon the house. 4 doorkeepers brought and placed on each side of the throne 4 high candelabra filled with wax lights. The throne, thus illuminated, shone in a kind of purple light. It was empty, but august. The presence of the queen herself could not have added much majesty to it. The usher of the black rod entered with his wand and announced, "The Lords Commissioners of Her Majesty." The hum of conversation immediately subsided. A clerk in a wig and gown appeared at the great door, holding a cushion worked with fleur-de-lis, on which lay parchment documents. These documents were bills. From each hung the bill, or bourre, by a silken string, from which laws are called bills in England and bulls in Rome. Behind the clerk walked 3 men in peers' robes and wearing plumed hats. These were the royal commissioners. The first was the Lord High Treasurer of England, Godolphin. The second, the Lord President of the Council, Pembroke. The third, the Lord of the Privy Seal, Newcastle. They walked one by one according to precedence, not of their rank, but of their commission, Godolphin first, Newcastle last, although a duke. They reached the bench in front of the throne, to which they bowed, took off and replaced their hats, and sat down on the bench. The Lord Chancellor turned towards the usher of the black rod and said, "Order the commons to the bar of the house." The usher of the black rod retired. The clerk, who was one of the clerks of the House of Lords, placed on the table between the 4 woolsacks the cushion on which lay the bills. Then there came an interruption, which continued for some minutes. 2 doorkeepers placed before the bar a stool with 3 steps. This stool was covered with crimson velvet, on which fleur-de-lis were designed in gilt nails. The great door, which had been closed, was reopened, and a voice announced, "The faithful Commons of England." It was the usher of the black rod announcing the other half of Parliament. The Lords put on their hats. The members of the House of Commons entered, preceded by their speaker, all with uncovered heads. They stopped at the bar. They were in their ordinary garb, for the most part dressed in black and wearing swords. The speaker, the Right Honourable John Smith, an Esquire, member for the borough of Andover, got up on the stool which was at the centre of the bar. The Speaker of the Commons wore a robe of black satin, with large hanging sleeves, embroidered before and behind with Brandenburgs of gold, and a wig smaller than that of the Lord Chancellor. He was majestic, but inferior. The Commons, both Speaker and members, stood waiting with uncovered heads before the peers who were seated with their hats on. Amongst the members of Commons might have been remarked the Chief Justice of Chester, Joseph Jekyll, the Queen's 3 sergeants at law, Hooper, Powes, and Parker, James Montague, Solicitor General, and the Attorney General, Simon Harcourt, with the exception of a few baronets and knights, and 9 lords by courtesy: Hartington, Windsor, Woodstock, Mordaunt, Granby, Scudamore, Fitzharding, Hyde, and Berkeley. Sons of peers and heirs to peerages, all were of the people, a sort of gloomy and silent crowd. When the noise made by the trampling of feet had ceased, the crier of the black rod, standing by the door, exclaimed, "Oyez!" The clerk of the Crown arose. He took, unfolded, and read the first of the document on the cushion. It was a message from the Queen, naming 3 commissioners to represent her in Parliament, with power to sanction the bills. To wit, here the clerk raised his voice, Sidney Earl Godolphin. The clerk bowed to Lord Godolphin. Lord Godolphin raised his hat. The clerk continued, Thomas Herbert, Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery. The clerk bowed to Lord Pembroke. Lord Pembroke touched his hat. The clerk resumed, John Holles, Duke of Newcastle. The Duke of Newcastle nodded. The clerk of the Crown resumed his seat. The clerk of the Parliaments arose. His under-clerk, who had been on his knees behind him, got up also. Both turned their faces to the throne and their backs to the Commons. There were 5 bills on the cushion. These 5 bills, voted by the Commons and agreed to by the Lords, awaited the royal sanction. The clerk of the Parliaments read the first bill. It was a bill passed by the Commons, charging the country with the costs of the improvements made by the Queen to her residence at Hampton Court, amounting to £1,000,000 sterling. The reading over, the clerk bowed low to the throne. The under-clerk bowed lower still. Then, half turning his head towards the Common, he said, The Queen accepts your bounty. The clerk read the second bill. It was a law condemning to imprisonment and fine whosoever withdrew himself from the service of the train bands. The train bands were a militia, recruited from the middle and lower classes, serving gratis, which in Elizabeth's reign furnished, on the approach of the Armada, 185,000 foot soldiers and 40,000 horses. The 2 clerks made a fresh bow to the throne, after which the under-clerk, again half turning his face to the Commons, said, La reine levée. The third bill was for increasing the tithes and prebends of the bishopric of Lichfield and Coventry, which was one of the richest in England, for making an increased yearly allowance to the cathedral, for augmenting the number of its canons, and for increasing its deaneries and benefices, to the benefit of our holy religion, as the preamble set forth. The 4th bill added to the budget fresh taxes, one on marbled paper, one on hackney coaches, fixed at the number of 800 in London, and taxed at a sum equal to 52 francs yearly each, one on barristers, attorneys, and solicitors, at 48 francs a year a head, one on tanned skins, notwithstanding, said the preamble, the complaints of the workers in leather, one on soap, notwithstanding the petitions of the city of Exeter and the whole of Devonshire, where great quantities of cloth and serge were manufactured, one on wine at 4 shillings, one on flour, one on barley and hops, and one renewing for 4 years the necessity of the state, said the preamble, requiring to be attended to before the remonstrances of commerce. Tonnage dues, varying from 6 francs per ton, for ships coming from the westward, to 18 francs on those coming from the eastward. Finally, the bill, declaring the sums already levied for the current year insufficient, concluded by decreeing a poll tax on each subject throughout the kingdom of 4 shillings per head, adding that a double tax would be levied on every one who did not take the fresh oath to government. The fifth bill forbade the admission into the hospital of any sick person who, on entering, did not deposit £1 sterling to pay for his funeral in case of death. These last 3 bills, like the first 2, were one after the other sanctioned and made law by a bow to the throne, and the 4 words renounced by the under-clerk, La Reine et le Veau, spoken over his shoulder to the Commons. Then the under-clerk knelt down again before the 4th woolsack, and the Lord Chancellor said, Soit fait comme il est désiré. This terminated the royal sitting. The speaker, bent double before the Chancellor, descended from the stool backwards, lifting up his robe behind him. The members of the House of Commons bowed to the ground, and as the upper house resumed the business of the day, heedless of all these remarks of respect, the Commons departed. End of chapter 6. Okay, so chapter 6 was basically, we got 4 different things read, and each of them were great for the aristocracy and terrible for normal people. Just like taxes on taxes on taxes, and just insane. Increasing taxes, adding taxes. If you go into like a doctor's office or a hospital, if you're gonna be thrown out if you don't pay £1 to cover the chance that you might die and need to pay for your funeral. That's terrible. Oh, I don't like it. And each time it was decreed into law. Everything, and it was terrible. Ugh. All right. That's gonna be our last one. It's a long chapter. Chapter 7. Storms of men are worse than storms of ocean. The doors were closed again. The usher of the black rod re-entered. The Lords Commissioners left the bench of state, took their places at the top of the Duke's benches, by right of their commission, and the Lord Chancellor addressed the House. My lord, the House having deliberated for several days on the bill which proposes to augment by £100,000 sterling the annual provision for His Royal Highness the Prince, Her Majesty's consort, and the debate having been exhausted and closed, the House will proceed to vote. The votes will be taken according to custom, beginning with the Puisni Baron, Each lord on his name being called will rise and answer content or non-content, and will be at liberty to explain the motives of his vote if he thinks fit to do so. Clerk, take the vote. The clerk of the house, standing up, opened a large folio and spread it open on a gilded desk. This book was the list of the peerage. The youngest of the House of Lords at that time was John Hervey, created baron and peer in 1703, from whom is descended the Marquis of Bristol. The clerk called, "My Lord John Baron Hervey." The old man in a fair wig rose and said, "Content." Then he sat down. The clerk registered his vote. The clerk continued, "My Lord Francis Seymour, Baron Conway of Killicktalk." "Content," murmured, half rising, an elegant young man with a face like a page, who little thought that he was to be ancestor of the Marquis of Hertford. "My Lord John Levison, Baron Gower," continued the clerk. This baron, from whom were to spring the Dukes of Sutherland, rose and, as he repeated himself, said, "Content." The clerk went on, "My Lord Heneage Finch, Baron Guernsey." The ancestor of the Earls of Aylesford, neither older nor less elegant than the ancestor of the Marquis of Hertford, justified his device, aperto viver voto, by the proud tone in which he exclaimed, "Content." Whilst he was resuming his seat, the clerk called the fifth baron, "My Lord John Baron Granville." Rising and resuming his seat quickly, "Content," exclaimed Lord Granville of Potheridge, whose peerage was to become extinct in 1709. The clerk passed to the sixth. "My Lord Charles Montague, Baron Halifax." "Content," said Lord Halifax, the bearer of a title which had become extinct in the Saville family, and was destined to become extinct again in that of Montague. Montague is distinct from Montague and Montacute. And Lord Halifax added, "Prince George has an allowance as Her Majesty's consort. He has another as Prince of Denmark, another as Duke of Cumberland, another as Lord High Admiral of England and Ireland, but he has not one as Commander-in-Chief. This is an injustice and a wrong which must be set right in the interest of the English people." Then Lord Halifax passed a eulogium on the Christian religion, abused popery, and voted the subsidy. Lord Halifax sat down, and the clerk resumed, "My Lord Christopher, Baron Bernard." Lord Bernard, from whom were to descend the Dukes of Cleveland, rose to answer to his name. "Content." He took some time in reseating himself, for he wore a lace band which was worth showing. For all that, Lord Barnard was a worthy gentleman and a brave officer. While Lord Barnard was resuming his seat, the clerk, who read by routine, hesitated for an instant. He readjusted his spectacles and leaned over the register with renewed attention. Then, lifting his head, he said, "My Lord Fermain Clancharlie, Baron Clancharlie and Hunkerville." Gwynplaine arose. "Non-content," said he. Every face was turned towards him. Gwynplaine remained standing. The branches of candles placed on each side of the throne lighted up his features, and marked them against the darkness of the august chamber in the relief with which a mask might show against a background of smoke. Gwynplaine had made them effort over himself, which, it may be remembered, was possible to him in extremity. By a concentration of will equal to that which would be needed to cow a tiger, he had succeeded in obliterating for a moment the fatal grin upon his face. For an instant he no longer laughed. This effort could not last long. Rebellion against that which is our law or our fatality must be short-lived. At times the water of the sea resists the power of gravitation, swell into a waterspout and become a mountain, but only on the condition of falling back again. Such a struggle was Gwynplaine's. For an instant, which he felt to be a solemn one, by a prodigious intensity of will, but for not much longer than a flash of lightning lasts, he had thrown over his brow the dark veil of his soul. He had in suspense his incurable laugh. From that face upon which it had been carved, he had withdrawn the joy. Now it was nothing but terrible. "Who is this man?" exclaimed all. That forest of hair, those dark hollows under the brows, the deep gaze of eyes which they could not see, that head, on the wild outlines of which light and darkness mingled weirdly, were a wonder indeed. It was beyond all understanding, much as they had heard of him. The sight of Gwynplaine was a terror. Even those who expected much found their expectations surpassed. It was as though on the mountain reserved for the gods, during the banquet on a serene evening, the whole of the all-powerful body being gathered together, the face of Prometheus, mangled by the vulture's beak, should have suddenly appeared before them, like a blood-colored moon on the horizon, Olympus looking on Caucasus. What a vision! Old and young, open-mouthed with surprise, fixed their eyes upon Gwynplaine. An old man, respected by the whole house, who had seen many men and many things, and who had intended for a dukedom, Thomas, Earl of Wharton, rose in terror. "What does all this mean?" he cried. "Who has brought this man into the house? Let him be put out." And addressing Gwynplaine haughtily, "Who are you? Whence do you come?" Gwynplaine answered, "Out of the depths." And folding his arms, he looked at the lords. "Who am I? I am wretchedness. My lords, I have a word to say to you." A shudder ran through the house. Then all was silence. Gwynplaine continued, "My lords, you are highly placed. It is well. We must believe that God has his reasons that it should be so. You have power, opulence, pleasure, the sun ever shining in your zenith, authority unbounded, enjoyment without a sting, and a total forgetfulness of others. So be it. But there is something below you, above you, it may be. My lords, I bring you news of the existence of mankind. Assemblies are like children. A strange occurrence is a jack-in-the-box to them. It frightens them, but they like it. It is as if a spring were touched and a devil jumps up. Mirabeau, who was also deformed, was a case in point in France. Gwynplaine felt within himself, at that moment, a strange elevation. In addressing a body of men, one's foot seems to rest on them, to rest, as it were, on a pinnacle of souls, on human hearts that quiver under one's heel. Gwynplaine was no longer the man who had been, only the night before almost mean. The fumes of the sudden elevation which had disturbed him had cleared off and become transparent, and in the state in which Gwynplaine had been seduced by a vanity, he now saw but a duty. That which had at first lessened now elevated him. He was illuminated by one of those great flashes which emanate from duty. All round Gwynplaine arose cries of "Hear, hear!" Meanwhile, rigid and superhuman, he succeeded in maintaining on his features that severe and sad contraction, under which the laugh was fretting, like a wild horse struggling to escape. He resumed, "I am he who cometh out of the depths. My lords, you are great and rich. There lies your danger. You profit by the night, but beware. The dawn is all powerful. You cannot prevail over it. It is coming. Nay, it is come. Within it is the dayspring of irresistible light. And who shall hinder that sling from hurling the sun into the sky? The sun I speak of is right. You are privilege. Tremble. The real master of the house is about to knock at the door. What is the father of privilege? Chance. What is his son? Abuse. Neither chance nor abuse are abiding, for both a dark morrow is at hand. I am come to warn you. I am come to impeach your happiness. It is fashioned out of the misery of your neighbor. You have everything, and that everything is composed of the nothing of others. My lords, I am an advocate without hope, pleading a cause that is lost, but that cause God will gain on appeal. As for me, I am but a voice. Mankind is a mouth of which I am the cry. You shall hear me. I am about to open before you, peers of England, the great assize of the people, of that sovereign who is the subject, of that criminal who is the judge. I am weighed down under the load of all that I have to say. Where am I to begin? I know not. I have gathered together in the vast diffusion of suffering my innumerable and scattered pleas. What am I to do with them now? They overwhelm me, and I must cast them to you in a confused mass. Did I foresee this? No. You are astonished, and so am I. Yesterday I was a mountebank. Today I am a peer. Deep play. Of whom? Of the unknown. Let us all tremble. My lords, all the blue sky is for you. Of this immense universe you see but the sunshine. Believe me, it has its shadows. Amongst you I am called Lord Fermain Clan Charlie, but my true name is one of poverty. Gwynplaine. I am a wretched thing carved out of the stuff of which the great are made, for such was the pleasure of a king. That is my history. Many amongst you knew my father. I knew him not. His connection with you was his feudal descent. His outlawry is the bond between him and me. What God willed was well. I was cast into the abyss. For what end? To search its depths. I am a diver, and I have brought back the pearl, truth. I speak because I know. You shall hear me, my lords. I have seen, I have felt. Suffering is not a mere word, yet happy ones. Poverty I grew up in. Winter has frozen me. Hunger I have tasted. Contempt I have suffered. Pestilence I have undergone. Shame I have drunk of. And I will vomit all these up before you, and this ejection of all misery shall sully your feet and flame about them. I hesitated before I allowed myself to be brought to this place where I stand now, because I have duties to others elsewhere, and my heart is not here. What passed within me has nothing to do with you. When the man whom you call Usher of the Black Rod came to seek me by order of the woman who you call the Queen, the idea struck me for a moment that I would refuse to come. But it seemed to me that the hidden hand of God pressed me to the spot, and I obeyed. I felt that I must come amongst you. Why? Because of my rags of yesterday. It is to raise my voice among those who have eaten their fill that God mixed up within the famished. Oh, have pity. Of this fatal world to which you believe yourselves to belong, you know nothing. Placed so high, you are out of it. But I will tell you what it is. I have experienced enough. I come from beneath the pressure of your feet. I can tell you your weight. Oh, you are masters. Do you know what you are? Do you see what you are doing? No. Oh, it is dreadful. One night of storm, a little deserted child, an orphan alone in the immeasurable creation. I made my entrance into that darkness which you call society. The first thing that I saw was the law, under the form of a gibbet. The second was riches, your riches, under the form of a woman dead of cold and hunger. The third, the future, under the form of a child left to die. The fourth, goodness, truth, and justice, under the figure of a vagabond whose sole friend and companion was a wolf. Just then, Gwynplaine, stricken by a sudden emotion, felt the sobs rising in his throat, causing him, most unfortunately, to burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. The contagion was immediate. A cloud had hung over the assembly. It might have broken into terror. It broke into delight. Mad merriment seized the whole house. Nothing pleases the great chambers of sovereign men so much as buffoonery. It is their revenge upon their graver moments. The laughter of kings is like the laughter of the gods. There is always a cruel point in it. The lords set to play. Sneers gave sting to their laughter. They clapped their hands around the speaker and insulted him. A volley of merry exclamations assailed him like bright but wounded hailstones. Bravo, Gwynplaine! Bravo, Laughing Man! Bravo, Snout of the Green Box! Mask of Terence O'Field! You are giving to you are going to give us quite a performance. That's right. Talk away. There's a funny fellow. How the beast does laugh, to be sure. Good day, Pantaloon. How d'ye do, my Lord Clown? Go on with your speech. That fellow, a peer of England. Go on. No, no. Yes, yes. The Lord Chancellor was much disturbed. A deaf peer, James Butler, Duke of Ormond, placing his hand to his ear like an ear trumpet, asked Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, "How has he voted?" Non-content. "By heavens," said Ormond, "I can understand it, with such a face as his." Do you think that you can ever recapture a crowd once it has escaped your grasp? And all assemblies are crowds alike. No. Eloquence is a bit, and if the bit breaks, the audience runs away and rushes on till it has thrown the orator. Hearers naturally dislike the speaker, which is a fact not as clearly understood as it ought to be. Instinctively he pulls the reins, but that is a useless expedient. However, all orators try it, as Gwynplaine did. He looked for a moment at those men who were laughing at him. Then he cried, "So you insult misery? Silence, peers of England! Judges, listen to my pleading. Oh, I conjure you, have pity. Pity for whom? Pity for yourselves. Who is in danger? Yourselves. Do you not see that you are in a balance, and that there is in one scale your power and in the other your responsibility? It is God who is weighing you. Do not laugh. Think. The trembling of your consciences is the oscillation of the balance in which God is weighing your actions. You are not wicked. You are like other men, neither better nor worse. You believe yourselves to be God, but be ill tomorrow and see your divinity shivering in fever. We are worth one as much as the other. I address myself to honest men. There are such here. I address myself to lofty intellects. There are such here. I address myself to generous souls. There are such here. You are fathers, sons, and brothers. Therefore you are often touched. Here amongst you who has this morning watched the awakening of his little child is a good man. Hearts are all alike. Humanity is nothing but a heart. Between those who oppress and those who are oppressed, there is but a difference of place. Your feet tread on the heads of men. The fault is not yours. It is that of the social babble. The building is faulty and out of the perpendicular. One floor bears down the other. Listen, and I will tell you what to do. Oh, as you are powerful, be brotherly. As you are great, be tender. If you only knew what I have seen, alas, what gloom is there beneath? The people are in a dungeon. How many are condemned who are innocent? No daylight, no air, no virtue. They are without hope, and yet there is the danger. They expect nothing. Realize all this misery. They are beings who live in death. There are little girls who at 12 begin by prostitution and who end in old age at 20. As to the severities of the criminal code, they are fearful. I speak somewhat at random, and do not pick my words. I say everything that comes into my head. No later than yesterday, I who stand here saw a man lying in chains, naked, with stones piled on his chest, expire in torture. Do you know of these things? No. If you knew what goes on, you would not dare to be happy. Who of you have been to Newcastle upon Tyne? There in the mines are men who chew coals to fill their stomachs and deceive hunger. Look here, in Lancashire, Ribblechester has sunk by poverty from a town to a village. I do not see that Prince George of Denmark requires 100,000 pounds extra. I should prefer receiving a poor sick man in the hospital without compelling him to pay his funeral expenses in advance. In Carnarvon and at Strathmore, as well as Strathbachan, the exhaustion of the poor is horrible. At Stratford they cannot drain the marsh for want of money. The manufactories are shut up all over Lancashire. There is forced idleness everywhere. Do you know that the herring fishers at Harlech eat grass when the fishery fails? Do you know that at Burton Lazars there are still lepers confined, on whom they fire if they leave their tan houses? At Aylesbury, a town of which one of you is lord, destitution is chronic. At Penkridge, in Coventry, where you have just endowed a cathedral and enriched a bishop, there are no beds in the cabins, and they dig holes in the earth in which to put the little children to lie, so that instead of beginning life in the cradle, they begin it in the grave. I have seen these things. My lord, do you know who pays the taxes you vote? The dying. Alas, you deceive yourselves. You are going the wrong road. You augment the poverty of the poor to increase the riches of the rich. You should do the reverse. What? Take the worker to give to the idle. Take the tattered to give to the well-clad. Take from the beggar to give to the prince. Oh yes, I have old Republican blood in my veins. I have a horror of these things. How I execrate kings, and how shameless are the women. I have been told a sad story. How I hate Charles II. A woman whom my father loved gave herself to that king whilst my father was dying in exile. The prostitute, Charles II, James II. After a scamp, a scoundrel. What is there in a king? A man feeble and contemptible, subjects to wants and infirmities. Of what good is a king? You cultivate that parasite royalty. You make a serpent of that worm, a dragon of that insect. Oh, pity the poor. You increase the weight of the taxes for the profit of the throne. Look to the laws which you decree. Take heed of the suffering swarms which you crush. Cast your eyes down. Look at what is at your feet. Oh, ye great, there are the little. Have pity, yes, have pity on yourself, for the people is in agony. And when the lower part of the trunk dies, the higher part dies too. Death spares no limb. When night comes, no one can keep his corner of daylight. Are you selfish? Then save others. The destruction of the vessel cannot be matter of indifference to any passenger. There can be no wreck for some that is not wreck for all. Oh, believe it, the abyss yawns for all. The laughter increased and became irresistible. For that matter, such extravagance as there was in his words was sufficient to amuse any assembly. To be comic without and tragic within, what suffering can be more humiliating? What pain deeper? Gwynplaine felt it. His words were an appeal in one direction, his face in the other. What a terrible position was his. Suddenly his voice rang out in strident bursts. How happy these men are! Be it so. Here is irony face to face with agony, a sneer mocking the death rattle. They are all powerful. Perhaps so. Be it so. We shall see. Behold, I am one of them. But I am also one of you, O ye poor. A king sold me, a poor man sheltered me. Who mutilated me? A prince. Who healed and nourished me? A pauper. I am Lord Clancharlie, but I am still Gwynplaine. I take my place amongst the great, but I belong to the mean. I am amongst those who rejoice, but I am with those who suffer. Oh, the system of society is false. Some day will come that which is true. Then there will be no more lords, and there shall be free and living men. There will be no more masters, there will be fathers. Such is the future. No more prostration, no more baseness, no more ignorance, no more human beasts of burden, no more courtiers, no more toadies, no more kings, but light. In the meantime, see me here. I have a right, and I will use it. Is it a right? No, if I use it for myself. Yes, if I use it for all. I will speak to you, my lords, being one of you. Oh, my brothers below, I will tell them of your nakedness. I will rise up with a bundle of the people's rags in my hand. I will shake off over the masters the misery of the slaves, and these favored and arrogant ones shall no longer be able to escape the remembrance of the wretched, nor the princes the itch of the poor, and so much the worse if it be the bite of vermin, and so much the better if it awakens the lions from their slumber. Here Gwynplaine turned towards the kneeling under-clerks who were riding on the fourth woolsack. Who are those fellows kneeling down? What are they doing? Get up! You are men! These words, suddenly addressed to inferiors whom a lord ought not even to perceive, increased the merriment to the utmost. They cried out, "Bravo!" Now they shouted, "Hurrah!" From clapping their hands they proceeded to stamping their feet. One might have been back in the Green Box, only that there the laughter applauded Gwynplaine. Here it exterminated him. The effort of ridicule is to kill. Men's laughter sometimes exerts all its power to murder. The laughter proceeded to action. Sneering words rained down upon him. Humor is the folly of assemblies. Their ingenious and foolish ridicule shuns facts instead of studying them, and condemns questions instead of solving them. Any extraordinary occurrence is a point of interrogation. To laugh at it is like laughing at an enigma. But the Sphinx, which never laughs, is behind it. Contradictory shouts arose. Enough! Enough! Encore! Encore! William Farmer, Baron Leominster, flung at Gwynplaine the insult cast by Rick Quinney at Shakespeare. Histrio, Mima! Lord Vaughan, a sententious man, 29th on the Baron's bench, exclaimed, "We must be back in the days when animals had the gift of speech. In the midst of human tongues the jaw of a beast has spoken." "Listen to Balaam's ass," added Lord Yarmouth. Lord Yarmouth presented that appearance of sagacity produced by a round nose and a crooked mouth. The rebel Linnaeus is chastised in his tomb. The son is the punishment of the father, said John Hoe, Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry, whose prebendary Gwynplaine's attack had glanced. He lies, said Lord Cholmondeley, the legislator so well read up on the law. That which he calls torture is only pianoforte et dure, and a very good thing, too. Torture is not practiced in England. Thomas Wentworth, Baron Raby, addressed the Chancellor. My Lord Chancellor, adjourn the House. No, let him go on. He's amusing. Thus shouted the young lords, their fun amounting to fury. 4 of them especially were in the full exasperation of hilarity and hate. These were Lawrence Hyde, Earl of Rochester, Thomas Tufton, Earl of Thanet, Viscount Hatton, and the Duke of Montague. To your tricks, Gwynplaine, cried Rochester. Put him out, shouted Thanet. Viscount Hatton drew up his pocket a penny, which he flung to Gwynplaine, and John Campbell, Earl of Greenwich, Savage, Earl Rivers, Thompson, Baron Haversham, Warrington, Escrick, Rawlingston, Rockingham, Carteret, Langdon, Barchester, Baynard, Hunson, Kavanagh, Cavendish, Burlington, Robert Darcy, Earl of Holderness, Other Windsor, Earl of Plymouth, applauded. There was a tumult as of pandemonium or of Pantheon, in which the words of Gwynplaine were lost. Amidst it all, there was heard but one word of Gwynplaine's. Beware. Ralph, Duke of Montague, recently down from Oxford, and still a beardless youth, descended from the bench of dukes, where he sat, the 19th in order, and placed himself in front of Gwynplaine with his arms folded. In a sword there is a spot which cuts sharpest, and in a voice an accent which insults most keenly. Montague spoke with that accent, and, sneering with his face close to that of Gwynplaine, shouted, What are you talking about? I am prophesying, said Gwynplaine. The laughter exploded anew, and below this laughter anger growled its continued bass. One of the miners, Lionel Cranfield Sackville, Earl of Dorset and Middlesex, stood upon his seat, not smiling, but grave as became a future legislator, and, without saying a word, looked at Gwynplaine with his fresh 12-year-old face, and shrugged his shoulders. Whereat the Bishop of St. Asaph's whispered in the ear of the Bishop of St. David's, who was sitting beside him, as he pointed to Gwynplaine, There is a fool, then pointing to the child. There is a sage. The chaos of complaint rose from amidst the confusion of exclamations. Gorgon's face! What does it all mean? An insult to the house. The fellow ought to be put out. What a madman! Shame! Adjourn the house. No, let him finish his speeches. Talk away, you buffoon. Lord Lewis of Durras, with his arms akimbo, shouted, It does one good to laugh. My spleen is cured. I propose a vote of thanks in these terms. The House of Lords returns thanks to the Green Box. Gwynplaine, it may be remembered, had dreamt of a different welcome. A man who, climbing up a steep and crumbling acclivity of sand above a giddy precipice, has felt it giving way under his hands, his nails, his elbows, his knees, his feet, who, losing instead of gaining on his treacherous way, a prey to every terror of the danger, slipping back instead of ascending, increasing the certainty of his fall by his very efforts to gain the summit, and losing ground in every struggle for safety, has felt the abyss approaching nearer and nearer until the certainty of his coming fall into the yawning jaws open to receive him has frozen the marrow of his bones. That man has experienced the sensations of Gwynplaine. He felt the ground he had ascended crumbling under him, and his audience was the precipice. There is always someone to say the word which sums up all. Lord Scarsdale translated the impression of the assembly in one exclamation. What is this monster doing here? Gwynplaine stood up, dismayed and indignant. In a sort of final convulsion, he looked at them all fixedly. What am I doing here? I have come to be a terror to you. I am a monster, do you say? No, I am the people. I am an exception? No, I am the rule. You are the exception. You are the chimera. I am the reality. I am the frightful man who laughs. Who laughs at what? At you, at himself, at everything. What is his laugh? Your crime and his torment. That crime he flings at your head, that punishment he spits at your face. I laugh, and that means I weep. He paused. There was less noise. The laughter continued, but it was more subdued. He may have fancied that he had regained a certain amount of attention. He breathed again and resumed. This laugh which is on my face a king placed there. This laugh expresses the desolation of mankind. This laugh means hate, enforced silence, rage, despair. This laugh is the production of torture. This laugh is a forced laugh. If Satan were marked with this laugh, it would convict God. But the eternal is not like them that perish. Being absolute, he is just, and God hates the acts of kings. Oh, you take me for an exception, but I am a symbol. Oh, all-powerful men, fools that you are, open your eyes. I am the incarnation of all. I represent humanity, such as his masters have made it. Mankind is mutilated. That which has been done to me has been done to it. In it I have been deformed, right, justice, truth, reason, intelligence, as eyes, nostrils, and ears have been deformed in me. Its heart has been made a sink of passion and pain, like mine, and, like mine, its features have been hidden in a mask of joy. Where God had placed his finger, the king set his sign manual. Monstrous superposition, bishops, peers, and princes, the people is a sea of suffering, smiling on the surface. My lords, I tell you that the people are as I am. Today you oppress them. Today you hoot at me. But the future is the ominous thaw, in which that which was as stone shall become wave. The appearance of solidity melts into liquid. A crack in the ice, and all is over. There will come an hour when convulsion shall break down your oppression, when an angry roar will reply to your jeers. Nay, that hour did come. Thou wert of it, O my father. That hour of God did come and was called the Republic. It was destroyed, but it will return. Meanwhile, remember that the line of kings armed with the sword was broken by Cromwell, armed with the axe. Tremble, incorruptible solutions are at hand. The talon which were cut are growing again. The tongues which were torn out are floating away. They are turning to tongues of fire, and, scattered by the breath of darkness, are shouting through infinity. Those who hunger are showing their idle teeth. False heavens built over real hells are tottering. The people are suffering. They are suffering. and that which is on high totters, and that which is below yawns. Darkness demands its change to light. The damned discuss the elect. Behold, it is the coming of the people, the ascent of mankind, the beginning of the end, the red dawn of the catastrophe. Yes, all these things are in this laugh of mine at which you laugh today. London is one perpetual fete. Be it so. From one end to the other, England rings with acclamation. Well, but listen. All that you see is I. You have your fetes. They are my laugh. You have your public rejoicings. They are my laugh. You have your weddings, consecrations, and coronations. They are my laugh. The births of your princes are my laugh. But above you is the thunderbolt. It is my laugh. How could they stand such nonsense? The laughter burst out afresh, and now it was overwhelming. Of all the lava which that crater, the human mouth, ejects, the most corrosive is joy. To inflict evil gaily is a contagion which no crowd can resist. All executions do not take place on the scaffold, and men from the moment they are in a body, whether in mobs or in senates, have always a ready executioner amongst them, called sarcasm. There is no torture to be compared to that of the wretch condemned by execution, by ridicule. This was Gwynplaine's fate. He was stoned with their jokes, and riddled by the scoffs shot at him. He stood there a mark for all. They sprang up. They cried, "Encore!" They shook with laughter. They stamped their feet. They pulled each other's bands. The majesty of the place, the purple of the robes, the chaste ermine, the dignity of the wigs, had no effect. The lords laughed. The bishops laughed. The judges laughed. The old men's benches derided. The children's benches were in convulsions. The Archbishop of Canterbury nudged the Archbishop of York. Henry Compton, Bishop of London, brother of Lord Northampton, held his sides. The Lord Chancellor bent down his head, probably to conceal his inclination to laugh, and at the bar, that statue of respect, the usher of the black rod, was laughing also. Gwynplaine, become pallid, had folded his arms, and surrounded by all those faces, young and old, in which had burst forth this grand Homeric jubilee, and that whirlwind of clapping hands, of stamping feet, and of hurrahs, and that mad buffoonery of which he was the center, in that splendid overflow of hilarity, in the midst of that unmeasured gaiety, he felt that the sepulchre was within him. All was over. He could no longer master the face which betrayed, nor the audience which insulted him. That eternal and fatal law by which the grotesque is linked with the sublime, by which the laugh re-echoes the groan, parody rides behind despair, and seeming is opposed to being, had never found more terrible expression. Never had a light more sinister illumined the depths of human darkness. Gwynplaine was assisting at the final destruction of his destiny by a burst of laughter. The irremediable was in this. Having fallen, we can raise ourselves up, but, being pulverized, never. And the insult of that their sovereign mockery had reduced him to dust. From thenceforth nothing was possible. Everything is in accordance with the scene. That which was triumph in the Green Box was disgrace and catastrophe in the House of Lords. What was applause there was insult here. He felt something like the reverse side of his mask. On one side of that mask, he had the sympathy of the people who welcomed Gwynplaine. On the other, the contempt of the great rejecting Lord for Main Clan Charlie. On one side, attraction. On the other, repulsion, both leading him towards the shadows. He felt himself, as it were, struck from behind. Fate strikes treacherous blows. Everything will be explained hereafter. But, in the meantime, destiny is a snare, and man sinks into pitfalls. He felt himself, as it were, struck from behind. Fate strikes treacherous blows. Everything will be explained hereafter, but, in the meantime, destiny is a snare, and a man sinks into its pitfalls. He had expected to rise and was welcomed by laughter. Such apotheoses have lugubrious terminations. There is a dreary expression to be sobered, tragical wisdom born of drunkenness. In the midst of that tempest of gaiety, commingled with ferocity, Gwynplaine fell into a reverie. An assembly in mad merriment drifts as chance directs, and loses its compass when it gives itself to laughter. None knew whither they were tending, or what they were doing. The House was obliged to rise, adjourned by the Lord Chancellor, owing to extraordinary circumstances, to the last day. The peers broke up. They bowed to the royal throne and departed. Echoes of prolonged laughter were heard, losing themselves in the corridor. Assemblies, besides their official doors, have, under tapestry, under projections, and under arches, all sorts of hidden doors, by which the members escape like water through the cracks in a vase. In a short time the chamber was deserted. This takes place quickly and almost imperceptibly, and those places, so lately full of voices, are suddenly given back to silence. Reverie carries one far, and one comes by long dreaming to reach, as it were, another planet. Gwynplaine suddenly awoke from such a dream. He was alone. The chamber was empty. He had not even observed that the House had been adjourned. All the peers had departed, even his sponsors. There only remained here and there some of the lower officers of the House, waiting for his lordship to depart before they put the covers on and extinguished the lights. Mechanically he placed his hat on his head and, leaving his place, directed his steps to the great door opening into the gallery. As he was passing through the opening in the bar, a doorkeeper relieved him from his peer's robes. This he scarcely felt. In another instant he was in the gallery. The officials who remained observed with astonishment that the peer had gone out without bowing to the throne. End of chapter 7. Okay. Wow, what a doozy of a chapter. Okay, so it starts off by another possible law being read out, and it's basically saying, by passing this law, the aristocracy members will get 10,000 more pounds. And we're going through the line, the clerk is reading off names, people stand up, you say content or non-content, and you are allowed to talk about why you're voting the way that you're voting. And so the clerk is going down the line, all of these people, and then Gwynplaine's turn arises. And every baron before him has said content, because of course they do. Of course they want more money. And Gwynplaine arises and he's like, non-content. And everyone's head just like turns and they're just like, excuse me? And Gwynplaine goes on to say, there are people suffering. There are people in pain. There are people who are starving. There are people outside of this ivory tower that you have built that need help. And no, I'm not going to vote content for giving us more money when we could be helping them. And he's listing all of these things, and he's getting a little choked up when he starts talking about, Dea and his personal experience, his past in poverty, and how it wasn't, the prince's And the lords who helped him, it was people who were in poverty, vagabonds who helped him and gave him a home and welcomed him. And he gets a little choked up, and because he's getting choked up and he's nervous, he accidentally laughs. And that gives permission to everybody else in the House of the Lords to think, oh, it's a joke. He's joking. He's not being serious, obviously. And so they just start laughing hysterically. And Gwynplaine is like, I have more to say. And so he continues on saying the things that he has to say and just really ripping into like, you don't know what it's like out there, and I'm telling you, this is what it's like. My face is the reflection of what it's like. My face, while to you might seem like it is few and far between, no, I am a common person. I'm a normal person. You are in the minority, and you are the people that we are laughing at. And so he's just going on and on and on about it. And the lords just like don't really know what to do. And they're like shouting for him to continue, and some of them are shouting for him to stop, and like people are like loving it, thinking it's hilarious, and other people are just appalled by what he's doing. And there's two people who are lower than he is taking notes and writing everything that he's saying down and what everybody else is saying and everything. And he addresses them like normal people, which apparently is the wildest idea that any of the Lord has ever heard. And so that gets them going again to be laughing even louder. And it ends with, it just being adjourned, and Gwynplaine is just so stunned that he doesn't even realize that everybody has left, and he's the only one standing in this House of the Lords. And he leaves. And it is noted that how shameful that he left without bowing to the throne. Yeah, I can see some Joker. I can see Joker. I can see Joker. That was a doozy of a chapter, and oh my, the scandal. But that's going to be where we end tonight. I feel satisfied with picking up there next week. Let's finish next time. Let's do it. But yeah, that's gonna be it for me tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all so much for the support. Thank you all so much for being here. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Take care of yourself, everybody. Have a good one. Goodbye.